Hello and welcome to another episode of Echoes of the Past. My name is Zachary Graulich and I'm the Assistant Director of Education here at hmTv. And I'm joined today by Meryl Menashe, who is a second-generation Holocaust survivor and has been an active member of our hmTv community for very, very long. So Meryl, thanks so much for being here.
Always a pleasure.
So today we're going to be discussing one of the artifacts that we have in our collection here, a very recent donation that we actually got from Meryl herself. So Meryl, why don't you introduce the item and explain how you got this item?
Well, while I was being here volunteering and doing what I do at the center, I was a social studies teacher in Plainview. And I always was looking for the primary sources to bring back into the classroom so they could see it. I had newspapers on the wall. And my son was on a cross-country trip and found this treasure, which is September 1st, 1939, the day the war broke out. And he brought it home for me. You know, over the years, I've got Life magazines. I've got all sorts of things that eventually will all end up here. But for now, we have this one. So that's how it happened.
All right. And as you mentioned, this is from Kansas City Times, a newspaper that no longer exists in that name, but still exists in other entities. And so it's a remarkable piece. I mean, it's not in the best condition, of course, this newspaper that's now over 85 years old, but it's wonderful to see this type of primary source, as you said, because it also shows the perspective of what some people here in America were feeling at the time, what the reporting was at the time. And so it's interesting because I was, reading this, and of course, again, not in the best condition, so not too easy to kind of pick up and actually go through. But in looking at it, you see how they're referring to the Führer, of course, being Hitler, and what he's saying, what he's claiming, what they're anticipating he'll be doing next, and really what's going on. And they even mention on here how Hitler basically is validating this invasion of Poland because Poland has been persecuting the ethnic Germans that live within Poland. And of course, how Poland has apparently, according to Hitler and the Nazis, been kind of deliberately disobeying the border laws between Germany and Poland, starting these attacks on German communities, which of course we know for the most part now, over 85 years later, wasn't exactly the case.
Correct. They needed living space as the future leaders of the Thousand-Year Reich. They were entitled to that space. Poles were in their way. And they had a supportive ally in the Soviets that were very happy to carve up Poland because they felt the same way, that the Polish land was really their land that the Poles were encroaching upon. And then you have the poor Poles stuck in the middle of all of this and didn't know which way anything was coming.
Yeah. And you see, obviously, we know now through, the quotes and the obviously endless amounts of documentation to support it, that Hitler made it very clear to his troops, to his forces, that basically this was going to be very different from Czechoslovakia. They anticipated fighting. They were ready for it. They were in many ways happy to start this type of warfare, and that it was pretty much merciless, as Hitler said. He was fully ready to gun down men, women, and children. He told his troops as much because they really painted the Poles as this kind of subhuman race in many ways, different from the Germans, and that they were just kind of the enemy. And as you said, they needed living space. So the only way to do that was to eliminate them one way or another.
Either eliminate them or put them to work and use them as slaves. An interesting side note to this story is my father's name was Leon Beck, who was in the Polish army at the time, and we spoke about it. He goes, I had a horse, they had tanks, and he had to bring his own horse into the war. I had a rifle, they had machine guns. So the Poles were completely overrun by both the Soviets and the Nazis by superior technology. And yes, it was the first real battle test for the Nazi army because Austria was handed to them, Sudetenland was handed to them, they took over the rest of Czechoslovakia, and at that point the Allies said, one more country and we're going to do our best to stop them.
Yeah, and it's, interesting how you mentioned, the, memories that your father had that he would share with you, because obviously that's exactly what happened. That's why Poland really didn't stand a chance against the German army, because they were so far behind them militarily. They didn't have nearly the weapons or the manpower to compete with them. They were completely unprepared. And, what would later be known as the Blitzkrieg was just way too overpowering for them to handle. So it's interesting to hear that kind of firsthand perspective from your father, who was there and lived through it and thankfully was able to survive.
And if you think about it, you have the two most, out of the world powers, these were two of the strongest world powers, and they're going against, they're crushing this country of proud people that could not possibly stand up to them. And of course, that's when the Germans started going into the little Jewish towns and
Absolutely.
killing the Jewish people, which is what happened to the rest of the family.
Yeah. So for the listeners who don't know exactly much about this history, because I feel like most people just in the general public don't know exactly what took place and how quick it was, I have some dates that I want to point out so that people can really get an understanding of how quickly all of this took place. So on August 24th of 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed, basically an agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union that together they would divide up Poland and they would figure out a plan together that worked for both of them. And Hitler really rushed to make sure that this happened, that this got put in place by both parties, because he knew very quickly he was looking to invade Poland, which would happen only about a week later on, of course, September 1st, 1939, the day that this newspaper is from. And within a week, they had invaded the capital of Warsaw. About 9 days after that, the Soviets then invaded Poland from the east, leading Poland to then have a two-front war. And then within 11 days of that, the Polish forces surrendered in Warsaw. So basically, within a month, the entire country is just completely demolished, and there was really nothing that they could do. And a week after that or so, the final last resistance forces throughout Poland officially surrendered. So it was just over a month in its entirety, from the minute that the Nazis invaded to the last Polish forces surrendered. So pretty ultimate in their domination of this war, and it would later prove to be, evident of how successful they would be in going across the rest of Europe for the next 2 years or so. And so it's no surprise to hear that your father had that experience where there was just basically nothing that they could do.
No, you do your best to survive, and he ended it. Well, do we want to go? He ended.
Yeah, absolutely. Share what happened to him after that.
What happened is he got captured by the Germans. They knew that the Germans had a plan for Jewish people. They didn't quite know what it was, but they knew it wasn't a great place for Jewish men, even though they were in the Polish army. And they were captured as prisoners of war. They were not captured as Jewish people. And they decided to escape in 3 separate directions. He doesn't know what happened to the others. He got shot. He went to the Russians, figuring that it would be safer, and he asked the Russians to show him the way to Romania. And they said, "Nah, we're going to show you the way to Siberia instead, because you're also our prisoner." And that was another aspect of this. The Polish people, no matter who they got captured by, whether they be Germans or Russians, they were prisoners of war.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mentioned earlier, they were really viewed as just this group of people that could just be run over. Both the Soviets and the Germans had no real desire for them unless it was to use them for slave labor, of course. And that's why, as we mentioned, there's really no mercy shown to the civilians. About over 20,000 were murdered within the first few weeks of this war taking place. As I said, men, women, and children, it didn't matter. Many of them were being gunned down by the Luftwaffe that were, in the sky, shooting down on innocent civilians who were just living their lives, trying to survive, farming, whatever it is they were doing. They basically became innocent victims in all of this.
They did. And I'm not exact. Historically, my family they were from a small little shtetl on the border of Russians and Germans, and we were told they were taken out into the forest by the Germans and killed, but the Einsatzgruppen hadn't started. They hadn't started yet, so that part's a little fuzzy.
Yeah, exactly. But we'd see that this was kind of the warning signs,
it's definitely the
of what were to
precursor.
come.
I'm pretty sure that in the early days in 1939 that the Germans captured them and took them into the forest. And
we saw what they were eventually planning on doing en masse, when it came to basically the entire continent as much as they possibly could. And I think something else that's interesting about all of this history is many people, when they think about, of course, the Holocaust and the devastation that took place, they think of the main targeted groups that were sent to these concentration camps and that went, where the Einsatzgruppen, as you said, went town to town murdering groups such as, the Jews, the Gypsy, the Roma, Sinti. But oftentimes I feel like it gets forgotten in some places that the Polish people, the everyday Polish civilians were oftentimes one of the other large victim groups that were devastated by the Nazis. I think people think about, the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, lots of these groups that in some places, in some ways collaborated and were bystanders as well. but Poland was really hit hard by the Nazis.
If you go to Poland today and you tour and you go through a Polish tour, they're going to tell you 3 million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust and 3 million Poles were killed as well. Mm-hmm. So they equate the numbers, except in one case, Jewish people were 90% and 3 million Poles were a tragic number. It's not to say, to discount that, but it's certainly not equivalent.
Right, absolutely.
And the other thing, when you get newspapers like this in the United States and you look at them, you want to see the other things. I used to show the kids the advertisements. So, well, there's a horrible war going on. There's still comics in the paper. There's movies being played. There's items on sale in stores. So it's interesting to see the culture of the place that you get your newspapers from.
Absolutely. Well, and we see that even existing today. I mean, you have wars all over the world and conflicts and things, but in many parts of the world, just kind of everything keeps going as normal because there are obviously some aspects of life that are going to continue, that are going to keep going. But it's interesting, as you said, when you talk about World War II, how this was such obviously a global conflict. And really here in America and everywhere else, the war effort was kind of what was being pushed forward. You're supposed to be working towards the war effort. Women were leaving the homes and working in factories to try to help. Everyone was kind of doing their part. But as you said, there was still some sort of element of normalcy. I mean, you can even talk about how, they had women playing baseball because they wanted some form of entertainment while the men were away.
Another primary source for you that I haven't given, I have my mother's. We used to get autograph books. Now kids sign yearbooks. It was an autograph book at the end of the year, and it was 1942. Mm-hmm. So she had brothers getting ready to go into the war, and you're looking at this junior high school autograph book, and they write in it, "Roses are red, violets are blue. I love you." It's the war. How would they? Yeah. And so your average junior high school kid is really living their life unless there's a family member away. And even then they were living their lives.
Right. Well, I mean, fortunate enough that for the most part, the American mainland really was not affected in terms of obviously the war because there was no bombing going on here. There was none of that taking place. Very different story when you're looking at, the European families, even, of course, like the non-Jews, you have the Christians in Europe at this time, such as, the Polish people who they were not, Jews, if we're talking about the Gentile population, but their lives were obviously upended. So it's interesting. I always find it fascinating to think about how, especially during wartime, you can have one country or one group of people in the world that are living under one kind of social, economic situation. And then another part of the world, everything's just perfectly fine, unaffected. And that's just life. But you see how that was happening in Europe at the time, even because here in September 1st, 1939, that was such a devastating day for the Polish people and the Polish nation.
That's right.
But other parts of Europe were still completely unaffected, had no clue what was to come, and just kind of turned a blind eye because that's not our war, that's not our country.
September 1st, 1939, there's the war breaking out in Poland. Like you're saying, Poland is being decimated. My husband's family's from Greece. They were having parties and having a bar mitzvah, like everything was fine, and that's Europe. They could probably hear the bombs, and you would think.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how the war, life is complicated.
Yes, absolutely. And I think when it comes back to this newspaper and other primary sources like this, I think for us who give tours to students here on a regular basis, I always try to weave in a little bit about what was America thinking at the time? What was America saying? Because you have to make it relevant to the kids. It's so, to them, this is ancient history, 80, 85 years ago. Oh my God, that's, another lifetime. And it is. So I always try to weave in a little bit about what was the American government thinking? What were the newspapers saying? What were the American people thinking? And so, of course, USHMM has an amazing exhibit on just that. But this is just a small part of that story. What were the people of Kansas City on September 1st, 1939 reading? Well, this is what they were reading. This is what they were hearing. This was the first bit of information for them when it came to the start of World War II. And so I love to weave that in a little bit, again, to make it relevant to them.
I remember doing that with students in the computer room. It was part of the USHMM project to look at articles. And we didn't do too well because the New York papers were not unique. The USHMM were looking for small towns and what they were reporting, but the kids found things And yes, they found stories of the war and they found stories of life.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's like you said, when you look at a newspaper like this, it's stories of war all over the, the front pages, because that's the big story. But of course, as you flip through the other pages, it's just normal everyday news. They have the weather column right here on the front, right next to them talking about the Nazis invading and blowing up Polish ports. I mean, it's side by side, but this is life.
And it's not always the front page either.
Of course.
This is the front page. The Hitler is dead is the front page. Even Kristallnacht got the front page in a lot of papers. But as the war continued and America was not involved until Pearl Harbor, there was less and less on the front pages.
Absolutely. They kind of tie it in wherever they feel like they can fit it in. And we see that with even wars today, whether it be wars that America is directly involved in, indirectly involved in, or not involved in at all. You see how some days a particular event might be on the front page, and then every other day it's just kind of hidden within the pages that you have to go and find on your own, as if it's not really the most newsworthy thing.
It tends to be like around page 8 or 9. In the mornings, in the morning papers.
Yeah, exactly. So I just, I'm appreciative that you would take this item out of your extensive collection that I know you have and give it to us here. It's obviously something that I hope to use as much as possible. I'm sure we could share this with our community members in other ways, because again, I think that it really is such an interesting piece that we can try and use for our own educational purposes. Us here as the educators, as the docents, we have to understand in many ways, all sides, in order to be able to present it accurately to the students. We have to understand what America was thinking and doing, what Germany was thinking and doing, what the German people were thinking and doing, the Polish people, the Soviets. You have to understand all these different perspectives. And I think that's one of the challenges when it comes to Holocaust education. We talk about the perpetrators, the bystanders, the collaborators, etc. But depending on whose perspective you're looking from, who you label as the perpetrator, who you label as the victim, who you label as the bystander completely changes. So it's all about that perspective. And I think that we try to pass that along to the kids because we want them to understand how this can happen, how hate can take place, and how a war and subsequent genocide can happen. It's because you view yourself maybe as the victim and the other as the perpetrator, when in reality, maybe another government, another society views it the exact opposite way.
Yes, and we have many examples of that. You could go to the American Revolution, right? American Revolution, we created a country, we fought for our independence. And from the British point of view, we were rebels. And we were not patriots, we were traitors.
Absolutely.
And if any of the founding fathers would have been, if we would have lost and the founding fathers would have been caught, they would have been hung.
Yeah.
So that's a good story to tell.
Yeah, no, but it's a great example showcasing that difference.
Yes.
And it's something that I think all of our listeners right now can certainly understand. We all know the history behind the American Revolution, and you see how we viewed ourselves as the good guys, and these were the horrible oppressors, the British, and they thought that we were, as you said, traitors, and that we were disloyal and ungrateful for everything that the British government had done for us. So you see, that's just one example that I think all of us can understand, but it happens day after day, year after year, society after society, and war after war. And when it comes to World War II, you see how Hitler and the Nazis, they viewed themselves as the victims of the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, they felt that they were taking back what was rightfully theirs when they invaded Poland, because they felt that it was this false creation from the Treaty of Versailles in many ways, that it really didn't deserve to be this solidified entity because it hadn't really been for some time before then. So they felt they were doing the right thing, at least in their eyes, right to the Germans.
Well, their propaganda told them one thing, and others, and you also think about a newspaper. You show people don't read them anymore. So to show them to students to see this is how people got news, and you didn't get to, you have a question, let's ask Google. It's a little easier now. It's not actually not. It's easier to get information, but it's harder to determine whether it's
the right
fact
information.
or fiction.
Exactly. Yep. You can get all the information you want, but trying to figure out what's the trustworthy source versus the non-trustworthy source is a challenge, in itself today. But I think in many ways that was always the case. I mean, we know that newspapers even, 80, 85 years ago weren't exactly the most accurate. They all, in their own ways, kind of had a little bit of an agenda. But I think that What's different today is that you can go on Google and you might find instantly 100,000 sources talking about something. How do you possibly pick? At least back then, if you lived in Kansas City, you got your Kansas City Times every morning, and it was as simple as that. So I think that's the real issue, is trying to figure out what source to go to and how to figure out if it's trustworthy when you have unlimited options. It's kind of that dilemma that people talk about where, you have a menu at a restaurant and you want all the options, but then once you have so many options, you don't know what to go with. Sometimes it's easier when you just have the specials menu.
Exactly. I tend to go with that because it's overwhelming.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much, Meryl, as always, for your time, for this amazing donation. We really, really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to seeing what else you have in your collection that maybe one day you'll be ready to donate to our collections here as well.
Oh, there's always going to be more coming. And what was already in the past, what's already there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Meryl. And to all of our listeners, thank you as always. Feel free to find more episodes at hmtcli.org.